Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome to tonight's family webinar series. I'm delighted to welcome you back after a short break over the summer. And I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentation, which will be undertaken by Dr. Rachel Egan and Georgina Heffernan of our psychology team here in St. Patrick's Mental Health Services. Before we kick off, just a few housekeeping things to mention. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A for Rachel and Georgina, and hopefully we'll have some time to get to them at the end. A reminder that the webinar is recorded, and we're conscious that sometimes strong emotions can arise during the course of these webinars. So please feel free to do what you need to do to keep yourself safe and well in the moment, and do so in the knowledge that you can come back to the recording at a later stage if you need it. We upload the recordings to the website, the family section of the website, over the next couple of days, so it'll be there for you to go back to at your own pace and at your own time. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Rachel Egan, who'll be talking about overcontrol and mental health tonight. A really interesting topic. Welcome, Rachel. Welcome, Georgina.
Thanks a million, Elaine. Hello, everybody, and thanks so much for joining myself and Georgina tonight. So as Elaine said, we work in the psychology department here in St. Patrick's Mental Health Services. So I'm just going to share my screen and start our slides. So hopefully just come up. Yeah, here we go.
Perfect.
Great. So maybe to start, we just want to give you a sense of what we're hoping to cover tonight in our talk. So I guess the first thing we will talk a little bit about what is overcontrol and what do we mean by that, because it's not a very well-known term, I guess, and lots of people have different kind of maybe connotations or meanings around the idea of control. So we're going to speak a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk to you a little bit about the differences between overcontrol and under control, and particularly what that looks like and how that might manifest or present for your family member or loved one or someone that you're aware of that may be attending our service. We're then going to talk about the difficulties associated with costly and harmful overcontrol. And I suppose it's important to note here the reasons why we use the words costly and harmful, because actually being over controlled, as you'll hear us speak to a little bit, is not actually a bad thing at all. And in fact, there are many wonderful, amazing qualities in being over controlled. It's just when we have too much of it, we know that it can cost us and actually be quite harmful. And it underlies quite a few different mental health struggles. So we'll speak to you about that and what that looks like and what you might notice or identify, and how that plays out in our lives, and the impact, I guess, the impact on the person struggling, but also on their relationships. And then we're going to speak a little bit about the treatment available in St. Patrick's Mental Health Services. We have developed a new group therapy intervention called Group Radical Openness. We'll tell you a little bit about that and the research behind it, and kind of what some past group members have told us about their experience of doing Grow with us. And then we'll hand you back to Elaine at the end, and there'll be hopefully some time for questions and answers. So we really hope that this is helpful and informative to you, and we're looking forward to speaking to you about it tonight. So what do we mean by over control? I guess it's helpful if we maybe kind of roll back the clock a little bit. So back in kind of around the 1960s, there was a psychologist in Stanford University in the States called Walter Mischel, who was really interested in this concept of self-control. And he did this wonderful marshmallow test. Actually, if you Google it, you'll get many different versions of it on YouTube. It's very, very sweet and very endearing to watch. And he wanted to really kind of understand what does self-control look like, and can you see it in quite small children? So he did a study where he brought a number of really small children into a room, and he gave them one marshmallow. And he said, if you can wait something like 10 or 15 minutes and not eat the marshmallow, you'll get a second marshmallow. And it's very beautiful to watch, because some of the little kids have the marshmallow scoffed before he's even finished the sentence about waiting for the second marshmallow. And then you see another cohort of children where they're sitting there looking at the marshmallow and they're smelling it and they're really wanting to eat it, but they don't. They wait, and they wait to get their second marshmallow. And it's the idea of kind of delayed gratification and holding on and waiting till they kind of earn the second marshmallow. So he talked about this idea of self-control, and back then it was really seen as a good thing. This idea that the more self-control you had, the better, that it led to better education and better status in life, perhaps better job opportunities and things like that. So for many years in mental health settings in particular, there was quite strong beliefs around the more self-control you have, the better. And actually that it could be taught, that we could teach young people and teach ourselves skills about how to be more self-controlled. But then sort of over the years, some people started thinking, well, actually though, could there be such a thing as having too much of it? Could there be too much of a good thing? And what would that look like? And as it turns out, then people started to look at what happens if you do go too far up that continuum, where there's lots and lots of self-control. And some psychologists and researchers started to see, actually, there was a lot of people who were functioning very well in society, again, in terms of perhaps their work environment or in achieving, but were actually really, really lonely and suffering quite a lot in silence, and primarily having difficulties in kind of relationships and connections with others. So if I move this along, so in kind of trying to figure that out, I guess they then start to think about, so how do we see this? What does it look like? What is over control, and what might be at the other end of that continuum in terms of under control? And again, I guess just to let you guys know that I suppose traditionally in mental health settings, we would tend to have seen much more of under control, and that people would often come to our service maybe perhaps at a younger age, or receive support and help for under control much sooner than someone with over control, because it doesn't tend to be seen as much. So in terms of thinking about the differences, I guess the kind of core difficulties that people with under control would speak about and tell us about is what we would call kind of emotional under-regulation. So that sense that emotions are really on the surface, very much on display for everybody to see. People would describe a real difficulty in regulating emotions, very, very painful, and they would often talk about feeling quite chaotic. Whereas people with over control actually would tend to suppress and inhibit their emotions quite a lot. And they would describe quite a pervasive and intense feeling of emotional loneliness. So a sense of, I'm kind of existing, but people don't know I'm struggling or know I'm suffering. In terms of behavioral style, I guess people with under control would often describe feeling quite impulsive at times, kind of reacting quite quickly, maybe doing things a bit more in the moment, and sometimes having difficulties associated with that. Whereas again, people with over control would speak more about being quite risk averse. And what we mean by risk averse is that sense of not really trying anything new or novel or different out of quite an intense fear of perhaps failure or getting it wrong. And so they'll often describe having lots of regrets around missed opportunities in life. And again, the impact of that could be quite significant. The societal response, I think, is a really interesting one, because people who struggle with under control and quite extremes of under control will often attract disapproval. It's that sense of, oh gosh, again, the emotions are very on the surface and it can be difficult for them to regulate. And people would sort of tend to perhaps describe feeling that they might be quite rejected in that at times. Whereas interestingly, with over control, it actually attracts a lot of societal reward. So again, if we think back to Walter Michel's little kids in that experiment, if any of you are teachers or deal with young children, it's often, the quiet child in the corner that's reading their book won't be the child that you think, oh, perhaps there's something going on. That'll often be rewarded and thought, oh yeah, that's great. They're stoic, they're getting on with it. When in fact they may be suffering in silence. And again, people with over control would often say, but people always praised me for not showing emotion, or people praised me for being the doer and getting things done. And in terms of the thinking styles, I guess if I might invite you to imagine a really large elephant with a small rider on top, and in under control, the elephant represents emotion and the rider represents kind of reason and logic. And I suppose if you think about that, the elephant is going to steer and decide where it goes. Whereas in over control, it's the opposite actually, where the elephant represents logic and reason and thinking, and the rider represents emotion. So it can be quite small and not really have much of a say. In terms of relationships, then I guess people with under control would often describe really craving intimacy, really wanting quite close connections, and having quite intense fear of abandonment. Whereas people with over control would often talk about actually fearing relationships, finding relationships quite unsafe and terrifying, and coping with that by abandoning the relationship first. So they may perhaps have many relationships around them and be around people, but actually nobody really knows the true person or what's going on for them. And they will often describe, people who would attend our groups would often describe, oh, like I'd get out before someone hurts me, because actually I don't trust people, it's not safe. So there isn't a longing as much, and it's more coping by abandoning. But as we know in life, that isolation and loneliness are one of the biggest kind of predictors of mental health difficulties. So it can be a real struggle when that's the way that we cope. So in just moving on, so I suppose while I've described like many differences there and ways that we can see over control come across differently to perhaps under control, it is important to understand too that there are some similarities. And I guess the key difference in that is that they will kind of manifest and present differently. So you might be thinking, but how would I know if my loved one or someone I care for is struggling more with over under control? Because actually I can see some similarities. It's often the function of them or how they come across differently. And in terms of that, some of the things, I guess, to look out for, or things that we have learned from people that we've worked with and from years of kind of study and research around this, is that traditionally self-harm would have always been seen in mental health settings as something that's indicative of more under control. But actually, we know that many people who are over controlled self-harm. The difference being that it's usually done in private. It's often quite carefully planned, actually. Maybe a sense of I'll do it later when I'm on my own, and I just need a release. I need to feel some reprieve from distress. And often it doesn't require medical attention, or they may perhaps have the medical attention they need with them. So self-harm is certainly a feature of over control. It just presents a bit differently. And displays of emotion is another thing. So again, some might say, oh no, actually I do, you know, I can cry, I can have outbursts of anger. But actually when we probe or wonder a little bit more about that, it's usually in private or perhaps only in front of loved ones. So the person that attends work or the person that attends a social function would perhaps seem quite different, because they will often talk about having to be a certain way, having to wear the mask, not letting anybody in, again, out of protecting themselves, out of fear of being hurt. But often family members would describe, oh, actually, it's really interesting because, you know, they'll go up to their room and I'll realize an hour later they've been very distressed, but I wasn't aware. So loneliness is another key factor, I think, that we see across a lot of difficulties, but particularly with over control. And again, we have in there, you know, even within relationships. So it's not that the person necessarily will be alone. It's that they may have plenty of people around them, but nobody really knows kind of what's going on for them. Or they may be the very practical, pragmatic friend who sorts everything out or is the go-to person. And often people who attend our groups, will describe really wanting to be there for others and not burdening them with their difficulties. But it can be quite a one-way street. So there mightn't be a sense of having their emotional needs met. Then leakage or overflow is a term or concepts we use to describe that idea of almost like, if you had a bottle of like Coca-Cola or Fanta or something, you shook it and then you open it and it just all spills out. It's that idea of after quite a long time of suppressing or holding down emotion, there may be absolutely bouts of quite intense emotion that, again, you might think, well, that's not over control, that's much more under controlled. But actually, it usually comes after quite a long period of suppressing and not talking about how they're feeling or what's going on. And I guess what's interesting is that usually it's not necessarily warranted to the situation that's just occurred. So it might be that idea of just being the kind of final straw, which is why, and Georgina will speak to this a little bit more in a bit, but why we often don't see people who have difficulties with over control until later in life. So where they may have had, 20, 30, 40 years of what they would perceive as functioning really well, but actually not maybe processing or dealing with their difficulties, and then have quite a significant crash, I guess, is often the words they would use. And that felt sense of, I don't know where this came from. So quite intense overflow. And then again, the interpersonal difficulties, I think, as I said, are similarities in terms of people with both over and under control. But in over control, it is generally as a result of that lack of authentic social connection, where they'll talk about having to wear the mask, having to have the persona, and I guess being what they think they should be for the other person, perhaps more so than what feels right to them in the moment. So that can cause a lot of difficulties in marriages and relationships and families, because it can be that sense of, but actually the true me has never really had time or had a voice. So let's move along. So I guess then it's thinking, well, how does over control develop, or why would someone be over controlled? And again, like I mentioned earlier, I guess it is important to note that all of us will be on that continuum somewhere. And interestingly, many mental health professionals tend to be more on the over controlled side of things. So there's many wonderful supportive parts of being over controlled. And like that, then there are some significant costs if we have too much. But I suppose it is really important to know that it can develop for many different reasons. So, for example, it may develop quite early in life as a means of coping with trauma or abuse or chronically unmet emotional needs. So, if as a young child I learned that humans and adults are harmful and can't be trusted, then absolutely I'm going to learn to shut down and not connect to keep myself safe. And similarly, if I grew up in an environment where emotions were dangerous or never welcomed, or that anger was met with violence or sadness was met with violence, then again I might quite quickly learn, actually, to keep me safe, it's probably best that I don't express my needs, or I don't express what's going on for me. So that's kind of some of the things we would often see with people who come to our program. It also may be a way, kind of culturally, as a way of integrating into a family system. So if the family system is quite over controlled and intergenerationally, I know certainly in Irish culture, emotions and speaking about our emotions and talking about how we're feeling and what's going on for us hasn't always been something that's been very welcomed. So, it can often just be a sense of, that's how it was, actually. I just learned quite early that I needed to succeed and do and achieve and work hard. And that's how I got my worth or my value, or indeed love from another. It may also actually be an attempt to survive quite a chaotic and under controlled system. So again, people would sometimes describe growing up in a family where there was lots of difficulties, and they kind of quickly learned, well, actually, I need to be resourceful and just rely on me, because I can't rely on these people around me. So it's safer, again, if I don't connect or I don't show emotion and I just keep myself at a safe distance. So I guess the point we're really making there is that our environment understandably has a huge impact on our coping styles, on the lens that we view the world through, and an awful lot of that we don't get to choose. But for some people, it would be quite clear to think, okay, being over-controlled actually was a very understandable way that I kept myself safe. It may be costing me now and hurting me now, but actually there's parts of it I really don't want to let go of yet. So on that, I'm going to hand you over to Georgina. And if there's anything I've left out there, Georgina, please do feel free to add.
No, I think you covered it really nicely there. Thank you. So I might continue on from here. Yeah, so I'll give a brief overview of how, I suppose, costly over-control might present and go through each theme in more detail in the slides ahead. So I suppose one thing you might notice in a loved one or family member is how distant they are in relationships and the lack of, I suppose, true intimacy and authentic social connections. And this is quite common in people with over-control. They really lack those close, authentic, intimate connections, and they can be quite superficial in how they might interact with others. Another thing you might notice is the rigid patterns that they might hold or have. It's really common for, I suppose, this population to have a strong preference for, I suppose, situations where there are rules and prescribed roles. They have a really strong desire for structure, order, and hold really high expectations for themselves and for others. So, for example, maybe, having that rule in their head, I can never be late, I must never be late, and they're on time for everything, really early for everything. And also they would expect the same from other people. And again, I'll give more examples as we kind of move through the slides. So another theme that we kind of work on and grow is the emotional avoidance and suppression. So we would kind of call that maybe inhibiting emotion. Most of the time in Group Radical and Openness, we experience people in the group as people who tend to avoid, suppress, or mask how they really feel. Individuals that come to the group would often admit to us and to the group that they're not allowing themselves to cry. They don't allow themselves to go towards that sadness, or if there's anger inside, they don't allow themselves to, I suppose, voice that anger or be assertive in how they're feeling about a certain boundary being crossed. They may present with depression, OCD, anorexia, or anxiety. And I suppose all of these diagnoses would include aspects of over-control and symptoms of over-control, but it doesn't mean that if you have depression, you have over-control. I suppose over-control, like Rachel was saying earlier, it underlies many of these diagnoses. So we don't focus on diagnosis in the group at all. And I suppose oftentimes this is a really important thing for people to have in the background, but it's not something we focus on in the group. So their difficulties are often not seen until later in life. And like Rachel was saying, they can be present for many, many years, and they can be really hidden in the background and really struggling, but not noticed by anyone in society, not noticed by family members. They can be masking themselves really well in work, performing really well in work and in life, but deep down they can be feeling quite a lot of pain. So I might move to the next slide. So I suppose to give a bit more detail about what we mean when it comes to distance in relationships, I suppose oftentimes we would see people keeping others at a distance. I suppose, for example, not reaching out to family members or friends, sometimes avoiding people. They wouldn't be trusting of others at all because of past hurts, or I suppose it makes sense for them not to, go and meet friends if they've been hurt by friends before. So this would really keep them at a distance with friends and maybe family members as well that have hurt them in the past. They don't want to reveal personal information about themselves to others. For example, I suppose not wanting to burden family members, not wanting to burden friends. They don't want them to think, if they have their own struggles, why would I go to a family member if they have their own issues? I suppose that feeling of not wanting to burden others. They also might share information with family members, but not necessarily outside of the home. So it might be, sharing with brothers and sisters, but never sharing it with people at work. So it can depend on the individual, of course. They can be really skilled at wearing a mask and avoiding giving away too much. I suppose in group, people would often admit that they would give off the impression that they're doing really well, but actually they're putting on a front and wearing that mask, pretending they're okay. They may have a strong desire for connection, but also really, really fear that and distance themselves as a way of staying safe. At the moment in our group that we're doing at the moment, we've a lot of people in the group that are longing for that connection. And we see in group that, I suppose, that co-regulation piece where regulating with others brings that real sense of safety, which allows for a deeper connection. We would often have group members, share that home was never really a safe environment for them to share with family members. And that depends on, I suppose, the individual, what's been happening to them at home, what's happened in their past. And they would share that, I suppose, it feels safe for them to share with others in an environment where they feel heard and supported. Conflict avoidant and avoid feeling vulnerable. We've had group members experience a lot of conflict in the family home, and they would tend to avoid conflict, which makes sense. They would avoid feeling vulnerable because they may have grown up in an environment which, again, may have been unsafe for them. There was no space for them. And I suppose their needs may have not been met when they may have turned to an adult as a child. And I suppose when they turn to someone now, they feel like they might not trust them. And there's also this idea that the view that children should be seen and not heard. And I suppose a lot of people may still hold on to that view. We use two terms and ways of explaining how people relate to themselves, which is the unacceptable outsider, which I suppose the individual or person in the group would, I suppose, tell themselves if they really got to know you, they would never accept you. Oftentimes we hear that people in group tell themselves they're flawed, they're unlovable, and it can feel safer for that individual to stay outside of a group, tell themselves they're not good enough, I'll be rejected. And it makes sense why they would distance themselves from other people. Then we also use secret pride, which is another way of how people relate to themselves. They would often think that they're special or at least different from other people. And they can keep people at a distance, they can keep family members at a distance, friends at a distance, because they speak to themselves, like telling themselves, I'm different, they won't get me, they won't understand me. And this really stops them from connecting with others. I suppose the final point in this theme of distancing relationships, and sometimes we refer to it as connection as well, they may hold on to grudges and past hurts. And I was thinking, I would be someone who may hold on to grudges as well. If someone deeply hurt me and I wouldn't forget that. I think I've had family members before, say something that may have really hurt me, and I may hold on to that for many, many months. And, we've had group members come with similar stories, but actually hold on to stuff for years and years and years, really holding on to those grudges. So yeah, we might move on to the next slide. So the second theme is rigidity. And you might find that a family member or a loved one has a really strong desire for structure, control, and having rules in their lives. They may have a strong routine day to day, or certain duties that have to be carried out. Close family members, for me, you know, they've been in the same routine for years and years, and group members would often share the same. You know, they have to carry out certain duties to make them feel like they're in control. And if something gets in the way in that, it might really throw them, it might upset them, it might make them feel really irritable that they didn't get a task done. So there's a real strong desire to get stuff done, feel in control, and have rules day to day. They would often avoid uncertainty and dislike ambiguity. For something that's unclear, they must, I suppose, feel like they can understand or need to know the plan ahead. I suppose sometimes I see this happen for myself. If I don't know what the plan is for the week ahead, I feel very agitated. But this can work in many people's favor, but we often see people stop engaging in daily activities to avoid any uncertainty. It can be a safer option for them, but this can be a huge cost. If you're avoiding uncertainty all of the time, it can lead to, you know, loneliness. It can stop you from engaging in daily activities. So that's the real cost to avoiding uncertainty. We'd often see traits like, you know, perfectionism. People would be quite high achieving, have a really strong work ethic. And this, sometimes aspects of this can lead to procrastination. And many group members would relate to this particular, I suppose, theme as well. Perfectionism can also be strongly linked to procrastination. And that's a really important one to remember or to think about as well. Is this happening in your family? So I was thinking about, you know, nothing will ever be perfect or good enough. So therefore they might put it off or delay or avoid doing the task altogether. And this often links to the fear of failure. They may also have rules about how they and others should behave. So for example, maybe in work, you know, I have to be punctual, others must be punctual. I must be professional, others must be professional. So they have rules about how they should behave and how others should behave as well. Also thinking about it socially. So how they behave around friends, how they behave around family members. You know, I must be good fun around my friends and I must behave a certain way around my family. So they might have different personas in work and at home, again, for different family members. So, and they can hold these as really core values. They dislike, I suppose, people with overcontrol can really dislike spontaneity or fun. And I suppose play and fun must be earned. And they don't, I suppose it's hard to see the value if it's not productive. And I suppose sometimes group members would definitely admit to this. And we play games in the group and they would often voice, you know, it feels like that was a waste of time. I should be doing more. It feels self-loathing and really finding it hard to engage in the play because they feel like maybe I should be doing something more productive here. Really beating themselves up about, you know, engaging in play and fun activities because it's unproductive. They may have a difficulty with taking on others' perspectives. They can be harshly critical of themselves and they may extend this to others. And you might notice this, you know, from a family member or a close friend as well. The last thing on this theme as well, they can be highly punishable of themselves, you know, for not meeting their own standards. And this can be quite extreme in some cases, you know, feeling that they didn't earn, I suppose, that feeling that they did not earn it and they can't eat it, that item of food that they feel like they've, you know, haven't worked hard enough to eat, or they must excessively exercise, or in, you know, more extreme cases, they can it can often lead to self-harm and feeling like they've let other people down or let themselves down as well. And that can be really hard as a family member to feel that for a family member, and also see that in another family member, and just to mind yourself if that is something that you have seen before or been a part of that in your family. So we might move to our third and final theme, and this is inhibited emotion. So I suppose just before I start this slide, the difference between experience and expression, just keep that in mind while I'm going through it. So there is that difference. So they would inhibit the experience of emotion. So they would avoid certain social situations or events, or certain people that might bring up emotion for them. Someone in their past, maybe that's made them feel really sad, or someone that's really hurt them, they might avoid them to avoid feeling any sort of sadness. You might notice someone in the family, like Rachel was saying earlier, spending a lot of time in their bedroom, and oftentimes we hear group members experiencing sadness on their own, and that's because they don't want to experience that sadness or anger, and oftentimes expressing it on their own in their bedroom, it's a safer way for them to experience any emotion. Inhibiting the expression of emotion, so really masking their feelings, the tendency to say, I'm fine, when really they are suffering inside. You might experience this at home if a family member who comes across as sad or angry, their response might be, I'm grand, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm fine. I suppose this can usually be the teller for when someone's visibly upset or it seems a bit shaken. And sometimes this can be a hard conversation to have with the family member. And it can be hard for you to, I suppose, address or have that conversation with the loved one who is, I suppose, coming across as if they are hiding something or holding on to something. Some may feel emotions quite intensely, but work very hard to suppress and numb them. And others describe not feeling anything, like a constant numbness, like really feeling nothing. We would have group members definitely come in sometimes to group and say they don't feel anything. But by the end of the group, they're kind of, they've heard other people's stories and they might admit to feeling something. So there's definitely feelings inside, but they might feel, I suppose, numb one day compared to the next. So it's very dependent on the individual and the day as well. So they may have strong rules or beliefs about emotion. So like Rachel was saying earlier, anger can be seen as bad in the house, or sadness is weak, showing too much joy is showing off. Some group members have often said, sadness was never welcomed in my house. I was never allowed to cry. It was always shut down. It was always dismissed. And it's really definitely hard to hear that when someone comes to group and says, that was dismissed. As an adult, this often would lead to suppression of emotion. They don't feel like they can allow the sadness because for so long it's been pushed down, feeling like it has been dismissed. Emotions may also manifest physically. So you might notice in a family member, they might have, shaky hands. They might feel quite agitated or nervous, or they might feel like, the experience of headaches as well from holding on to a lot of tension. They might have the tight chest, tense shoulders, quite, high up. Might notice that they're really holding on to something or want to say something. And instead of signaling the emotion, it might come out physically in those ways that I've just said. Also, the final thing, I suppose, on inhibited emotion, they may experience emotional overflow, like Rachel did touch on earlier. And this is when they're really bottling up emotions. And this can lead to, I suppose, an overspill of emotion. And that's, again, this is just a reminder here that this can be part of overcontrol. It might not happen to, I suppose, everyone, but in general, you would see this over time, that the emotions will, I suppose, spill over. So as the last thing, to as well to mention, it can be hard to talk to a loved one about this, but just to remember to be patient, kind, and understanding can really start to help them come forward in talking, and I suppose how they deal with their own emotions. And it might be helpful for you to explore their beliefs around emotions as well. So I might hand you back over to Rachel.
Thanks, Georgina. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit now about the intervention and treatment available in St. Patrick's Mental Health Service. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a group called Group Radical Openness. And I suppose maybe to give you a little bit of background on that, originally the kind of first intervention or first therapeutic approach for people who were struggling with quite costly and harmful overcontrol was developed by a man called Tom Lynch. He's an American psychologist, and he developed a skills class that was called RO, Radical Openness, DBT, which stands for Dialectical Behavior Therapy. So he worked for many, many years with people who were under-controlled, and then like that realized, oh, actually, I think there's a whole population, a whole cohort of people who are really suffering, who were not actually providing any support to. And again, like Georgina mentioned, I guess in terms of how that often comes or what it would look like in mental health settings is people with kind of chronic and long-standing depression. It's often termed treatment-resistant depression, which is a phrase that we as psychologists aren't particularly keen on, but it means that people haven't maybe responded very well to traditional interventions. They may also, as Georgina was saying, have like quite severe anxiety or avoidance tendencies, so avoidant difficulties or obsessive compulsive tendencies, or indeed kind of anorexia nervosa, difficulties like that. So he developed a skills class. So it was like you attended a class and you learned how to socially signal, how to connect more, how to label and learn about emotions. So in St. Pat's, we originally took the skills class piece and we tried it out. But I guess one of the things about kind of 10 years ago or so, we started that. One of the things we really learned from the people we were working with was actually the skills class idea we didn't feel was perhaps really meeting their needs. What seemed to have been really helpful was the group therapy approach. So that idea of being with people who suffered in the same way, kind of developing understanding together and trying out. So rather than learning, so spending too much time in our heads and learning how to, it was more, maybe if I experience it with, because I guess, again, from our perspective, it's not that people who are over control don't have the capacity to experience emotion or anything like that. They have amazing capacity. It's often that it's been a learned way of coping for very, very valid reasons. So we moved away from the idea of a skills class and we developed this new kind of therapeutic intervention that is specifically group focused. So it's a transdiagnostic approach. And what we mean by that is simply that, as we've mentioned, is that we don't focus on specific diagnosis per se. So essentially people who come to the group will have many different diagnoses, but they will all share a common underlying over-control difficulties. It is a lengthy enough intervention, so it's 27 sessions over a 5-month period. And again, I guess we feel from kind of years of doing some research and getting feedback from people who are in our groups that that's needed to kind of do the work and to work through the exercises and the experiences together. So it's twice a week for the first 12 weeks, and then we taper off towards the end to kind of build towards our ending. So I guess it is quite a commitment in terms of people who are signing up for it and wanting to attend. There is everything generally happens in group and everything is processed in group, but we do have one individual reflection session at our midpoint just to kind of check in and see how people are finding group and to ensure that we're on track and we're meeting their needs. And again, that will come back into the group process. And we have a final individual session after the group has ended where we write a therapeutic letter to the person and we read it back to them and ensure that it's collaborative and fitting and then it's copied to their multidisciplinary team and PATS. We will always encourage people to read their therapeutic letter with their family members or loved one. And indeed, sometimes we may have some recommendations for some further interventions if that's appropriate or feels that's needed at that time. But we would generally tend to encourage them to do that. So what actually happens in the group? Well, there's, I guess, fundamentally, the focus is on those three core themes that Georgina went through. So distance in relationships, rigidity, and inhibited emotion. And in those themes, we're working on the distance in relationship, we're working towards connection. On rigidity, we're working towards flexibility. And on inhibited emotion, we're working towards experiencing and expressing emotion. And again, we're not saying that we're going to go from one extreme to another, and we would always be very open with people we work with and talk about this and say, you know, you may just want to move a little bit up that continuum, or you may decide, you know what, actually two of those three themes are really, really pertinent in my life and causing me difficulties in my life and my relationships and my family. And one of them, not so much, or I'm okay with parts of them. So it's not about this, even though the word is radical, it isn't about radical change. It is more about kind of approaching it in a way that feels safe and supportive. So there's lots of experiential exercises. And again, what we mean by that is learning and doing together. So practicing particular kind of psychotherapeutic exercises where they will experience connection together, experience and emote in group, and experience flexibility and working on softening those rigid protectors. So the first 15 sessions, we sort of see it as very much really developing awareness, curiosity, and a deeper understanding of overcontrol and how it impacts their lives. And then after that midway reflection session, which happens after session 15, their focus is slightly more on change, and we have particular exercises in the group to facilitate this. And again, that's very much done in a collaborative way of what are the parts of your life that you want to work towards and softening in terms of your overcontrol. Let's try that out here in group. Let's see what fears and obstacles and barriers came up and discuss that together, and then think about how you might generalize that to your life outside of group. So I suppose at this point, it's really worth mentioning that safety is paramount to I guess to anything, isn't it? You know, we can't learn or grow or change if we don't feel safe. You know, so ultimately, safety is the key, and it is a really core part to our work in Grow. And polyvagal theory is, I guess, a theory that we use that helps inform this work. Again, over the years, sort of from feedback from service users and our clients and people we work with, they've often described the polyvagal theory as a really supportive, sort of kind of gentle language that we use to help us understand, you know, why we might be feeling the way we're feeling or what's happening. And in a nutshell, polyvagal theory helps us think about our nervous system and how our nervous system is very much linked to our emotions and our thoughts. And there are kind of three core parts to this, and we call it our polyvagal ladder because it's helpful to think of it in steps and stages. And we could have 40 rungs in our ladder, or we could have 20. So again, that'll be quite individual and unique to us and our experiences. But to give you a little sense of that, I guess at the very bottom of the ladder is what we would call dorsal, and that's a real sense of being numb, collapsed, shut down, very disconnected. I guess if you were to think of it in sort of evolutionary terms, it's like the animal playing dead to survive. So people, again, who would talk about being in dorsal a lot of the time just say, I'm just shut off. You know, it's just easier to be this way. I don't feel the pain because I have it shut off. I have it numbed. As we move up towards the middle of the ladder, is that more what is termed our sympathetic part of our polyvagal nervous system, and it's that kind of more agitated fight or flight. It's a bit more activated. People often describe feeling quite restless and mobilized, and perhaps even a little frantic in its needing to get things done. And then as we move further up the ladder is what's our social safety system, and that's our ventral system. And in that, we are safe and connected in this moment. I suppose, again, it's important to know that at any stage in the day, we are somewhere on our ladder. So I know certainly before I started today, I was definitely in my sympathetic, nervous, fight or flight energy, and I'm feeling more moving towards my ventral, but that ebbs and flows. So it's really natural. We go up and down it all the time. It's biological. It helps us survive. We wouldn't want to be in one of them all the time, and nor would it be possible. Our bodies and our minds couldn't do that. We just tend to move up and down. But I suppose what's really important is that most people who struggle with costly overcontrol live a life in sympathetic or dorsal and quite rarely visit ventral, which is obviously deeply sad and has quite an impact. And again, I suppose just it's important to know that ventral doesn't mean happy and everything's okay. It just means safe and connected in this moment. So I might experience sadness in ventral, but it's a very safe, connected sadness. I'm able to reach out. I'm able to get support. I'm perhaps able to cry and say to someone, I need comfort. Also, my anger, I may experience anger in ventral where I'm asserting a boundary or saying, actually, what you said there isn't okay, or no, you can't do that. Whereas anger or sadness in sympathetic or dorsal would appear quite differently. So a key aim of our group in Group Radical Openness is that we help people really get to understand their own personal ladders and to help them experience connection, flexibility, and emotions in a ventral state, even if it's just momentarily. And what was that like? And how what's more familiar? Are they more usually in sympathetic or dorsal? And I suppose knowing that we can move up, but we need others to help us do that, which again is why we feel the group process works really well. Which leads me to my last little piece around the group, which is this idea of tribe, I suppose, and of common humanity, in that we all suffer as humans and that nobody in life goes unscathed. You know, we will all have different experiences, but times in our lives when we've struggled and had difficulties. So we really feel that actually the group members are the core agent of change. And again, what we mean by that is they support each other and they laugh with each other, they cry with each other, they build each other up, they carry each other. And that's profoundly healing. And we know that from kind of lots of research, and Georgina is going to speak a wee bit about that in a moment. But actually, just even feedback from every cycle, people will often say, you know, the thing that actually was the turning point for me was being together, was experiencing this with other people and not feeling alone. So it's that antidote to that intense loneliness that we talked about earlier. So huge power of accompanying, and we use the word accompanying, and that kind of means coming along with, and you know, that can include gentle challenges at times, or you know, giving feedback to each other and saying, I'm not sure, you know, what was that, and having little ruptures and repairs, but really learning, yeah, I can actually trust people, and there are some people out there who I can feel safe with, and this feels really good, and therefore has obviously really positive supportive impact on my mental health. And it's hugely respectful and collaborative, and we find that every time in the group. And again, the idea being if people can experience that within this group therapy setting, then that can generalize to life outside. So I'm going to hand you over to Georgina now to talk a little bit about our referral pathway and research.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So yeah, just to really highlight a couple of things about the referral pathway, and then I'll talk a little bit about research, and then we'll finish up. So just to say, the patient must be under the active care of a consultant on an MDT, so a multidisciplinary team. I suppose the importance of having the support of an MDT, you know, having access to those services while doing the program is really important, because it can be quite challenging and tough, and it can bring up a lot for people when they're doing the program. So it's important for you to know as a family member that there is that other support in the background in the hospital. Another point there is the referral must come through a team psychologist. So we don't accept referrals from GPs. It must be from a team psychologist in St. Patrick's facilities. And they will determine whether or not GROW is appropriate intervention for a family member or anyone who comes to St. Pat's. The team psychologist will meet with the person and decide with them and determine with them if GROW is needed. And I suppose the importance of ensuring we are meeting the person's needs at this time. We're not just putting them into the group for the sake of it. Timing's really important. Are they ready to do the group? Are they ready to go and do the work? Are they ready to commit to 27 sessions? For you as a family member, know that it will be hard and painful at times, but know how you can support them is by encouraging them and knowing healing does take time. Yeah, so that's all I'll say about the referrals. And then I suppose the research and outcomes, Rachel and a couple of others from the GROW team did a feasibility study. They gave questionnaires before the group, after the group, and 6 months after the end of the group then. And they also interviewed participants on their experience of attending the GROW program. So the results showed a decrease of over-control traits and an increase of psychological well-being after GROW. And these gains were all maintained at 6 months post follow-up. So most of the changes were seen after 6 months. Participants reported positive shifts in self-confidence, agency, and general well-being. They talked about the importance of connection with other group members and feeling at home, and I suppose mentioning that common humanity piece as well. These factors were especially important in helping, make those changes and helping people feel less lonely. And every year we do annual outcomes, and they can be found on the website at St. Patrick's website. Our results consistently show GROW to be effective, supportive, and a suitable intervention for those who are over-controlled. And I suppose aside from the formal research that is carried out in the hospital, we always, think that every group member has a lot of feedback to give, and we really view their voices as very important. We learn the most from what group members tell us. And this is a perfect example. I suppose GROW has changed my life forever. For the first time ever, I was able to trust a group of strangers with my story. I knew instinctively that they would not judge me. This was profound and life-altering. I now know there are people like me in the world. I can meet nice people like in our tribe in the future and perhaps build strong friendships. Also, I'm now fully aware of how serious my over-control was and what it feels like to feel. So now I can continue to build on this going forward. I guess I want to feel the bad feelings so I can feel the good ones. I also want to be able to express my feelings as they arise, rather than shutting them down, swallowing them whole. This is a journey, and there have been ups and downs, but it was totally worth it. And then just a couple of others, and then we'll finish up. So for me, GROW has been a real opportunity to get to know myself and my emotions, and to better understand myself and my relationships. Another person said, I got a whole new sense of self from doing the program. I got a gift of awareness, and now I get to decide what to do with this. I had withdrawn a lot before this, and I hadn't even realized the extent of it. My over-control has helped me a lot in ways, but GROW has helped me see that it had become a double-edged sword, and the group helped me to change the parts that were holding me back in life. GROW is the best program I've ever done in PATS, and I'm so privileged to have been given a place in the group and to have been supported by everyone. I was able to feel safe for the first time in a long time, and it has been life-changing. I'll hand you back over to Rachel.
Thanks, Georgina. So that kind of takes us very much up towards the end. We just added a couple of references there, I guess, in relation to some of the studies that we mentioned, but certainly, like Georgina was saying, I think in terms of supporting a family member, a loved one, I guess the words that come to mind are very much around patience and curiosity and helping them understand and being with them on the journey. So I'm going to hand you back over to Lee and just to say thank you so much, and we really hope that has been helpful.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Georgina. At the moment, we don't have any questions coming in. I think your presentation was extremely valuable and informative. So perhaps we've a lot to think on and a lot to consider. I'm also conscious that the webinar may just cut off at 8:30, but as far as I can see, there's no questions in the Q&A box. So luckily we can finish up for tonight. There's one question: would this help with ADHD? Is it via webinar or face-to-face? That I presume that's referring to the group intervention, and whether it's targeted towards people maybe with neurodevelopmental difficulties, and whether what format it is delivered in.
Great. Yeah, certainly, again, like I was saying earlier, so I guess it is transdiagnostic. So we would have people with neurodiversity difficulties, certainly who've attended groups. So absolutely, again, like Georgina was saying, you would usually go through quite a detailed assessment just to make sure we're meeting the person's needs. And if there was another intervention that was more appropriate for their needs, we would talk about that with the person. But yes, is the answer to that. And in terms of the delivery, we actually have quite a lengthy waiting list. So we currently have 3 cycles running at the same time. And we run that twice a year, if that makes sense. We do a January to May cycle and a July to November cycle, obviously all of different people. 2 of those are in person and 1 is online for people who can't travel or have physical health difficulties. Our research, one bit that we didn't mention, has shown us that the in-person outcomes are just slightly better than online, but that does, and again, we would always tell our clients this to ensure they're fully informed. The online still had good outcomes, just in person was slightly better. And I guess that would make sense in terms of the nature of the work we're doing. But yeah, there's an option of 1 online group and 2.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And I suppose there's another question from a participant to say, is someone with autism more likely to be over-controlled? And I suppose that in part that relates back to your first answer.
Exactly, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Again, I think certainly, there's kind of lots of over-control underlies a lot of difficulties. So that's what we
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Georgina. There's some comments to say that a very interesting presentation. So thank you all for joining us tonight. As I mentioned at the beginning, the recording will be available on the website in the coming days. So if you want to rewatch it there along with our other webinars in the series, you can find that on our website. But for now, have a good evening, and thank you again both for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.